Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 275 library systems across 38 states with the goal of making author talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator in conversation with each of our wonderful best-selling, prize-winning, and acclaimed authors that you will hear from throughout our series year-round. Today, we are honored and super excited to have New York Times bestselling historical fiction author Pam Jenoff with us to talk about her newest book, Code Name Sapphire. Hi, Pam. How are you?
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Thank you for being here. Before we jump in, we're all very, very excited to dive in, but I do want to pause for one moment and give everybody that standard quick housekeeping information to keep everything flowing smoothly. We have compiled some viewer questions that were pre-submitted with registration, but we will also be taking additional questions, of course, throughout this entire conversation. So when you have a direct question for Pam, you can click that questions button that's just below the live stream. And you can submit that at any time. In addition, we invite you to interact with your fellow viewers in the live chat feature, also located below this live stream. It's always fun to see where everybody's tuning in from. And if you're unable to attend the full talk for any reason, you will receive a thank you for attending email in about 24 hours. And in that email, you can find a link to the recording. Now, to formally introduce our guest for today, Pam Jenoff is the New York Times bestselling author of The Woman with the Blue Star, The Lost Girls of Paris, The Orphan's Tale, and so many others, including a short story in the anthology Grand Central Original Post-War Stories of Love and Reunion, and the book of note for today, Code Name Sapphire. Pam was born in Maryland and raised outside of Philadelphia. She attended George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and Cambridge University in England. Upon receiving her master's in history from Cambridge, she accepted an appointment as special assistant to the Secretary of the Army. Following her work at the Pentagon, Pam moved to the State Department and left the Foreign Service in 1998 to attend law school and graduated from the University of Pennsylvania. She now teaches law at Rutgers, lives outside of Philadelphia with her husband, 3 children, a dog, a cat, a lizard, and a bird. And I feel like there's a rabbit as well, right? I missed
a rabbit and a second cat. I have to update that bio clearly.
I knew I was missing one. We just talked about it. So anyway, welcome. Thank you so much for being here this evening.
My pleasure.
So the word on the street is that you're a big lover of libraries.
Oh, thank you for that softball, because I really wanted to talk about libraries. So first of all, Brandon, thank you for all of your work in getting me here today. I know it was a moving target, just getting to a date, and it seemed a really long time ago, right? Or it seemed like March 28th was going to be far in the future, but
it seems to be a long time ago.
Here we are, and I'm especially excited because I am just passionate about libraries, not just as an author, but as a reader. So it is a true fact that in any given week, I use 5 separate library systems. It is a true fact that during COVID, the library called to check on me. And also that on the day of my 50th birthday, I celebrated by taking my children back to the library for the first time since COVID, first in-person visit. So libraries are just a very, very big deal to me. And I'm so grateful to be here with so many libraries and library patrons.
That's an amazing little anecdote. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, absolutely.
We definitely love to hear about the impact of libraries in everybody's life, because of course everybody tuning in today is doing so through their library. So it's a big community that we have. That's amazing.
It is.
Well, I want to start off. So some of the questions that we get the most for authors are your journey to being a writer. What brought you here?
Well, my journey started, I can't believe this month is 27 years ago, in a very unpredictable way. I was sent to Krakow, Poland as a diplomat for the US State Department. So I went to Poland basically to stamp visas and passports and help Americans kind of do the consular work that diplomats do. But at this moment in the mid-1990s, Poland and its neighbors had just come out of a half century of communism, and they had never resolved many of their most pressing issues from World War II and the Holocaust, about returning property and preserving the camps, and lots of really super tough questions. And these all like sort of were frozen in time until the 90s. And so when I turned up in Poland in 1996, I was this young woman in my early 20s. So now you all know how old I am. Let's just stop there. But I went to Poland in my early 20s. And if you think back to the mid 90s, we really did not have cell phones or the internet at that time. And so I went halfway around the world by myself, and I was completely isolated, no friends, no family. And I'm Jewish. And so my instinct was to gravitate toward the surviving Jewish community that still lives in Poland, the synagogue and the rabbi and the elderly survivors. And this community really, they became like grandparents to me. They took me in. And so the US government saw that I had a relationship with the people, the Jewish people in Poland. And they said, okay, you work on all the stuff from the war. And so for 2.5 years, that almost 2.5 years, that was my full-time job, was really working on issues related to the Holocaust. And it was very, very difficult work, but very, very meaningful work. And similarly, as you can imagine, and if people want to ask questions about it, I will not go on too long, but I have to say my personal life over there was also very rewarding and yet very difficult. And so I came away from those years in Poland. I did not continue on as a diplomat. I actually came back to the States and went to law school. But I came back to the States very changed by those experiences. And I knew that I wanted to write a book about it, in particular, a novel. So now Brandon's going, okay, this is how we get to the book story, finally. You might say, well, how did you know you wanted to write a novel about this? I have to tell you that going back even further in time, I was one of those little kids who always wanted to be a writer. It was never short stories. It was never poems. It was always going to be a novel. You know, my 5th grade yearbook said the next Judy Blume. So this is a very long-standing dream of mine, which is great. When I met Judy, I was like, huh? So I
That's a pivotal moment, by the way.
What's that?
Meeting Judy Blume is a pivotal moment, by the way.
Life moment. I won't digress too much. Like, met her, had my kids with me, went absolutely berserk when it happened, stayed at her house on book tour. It's like a whole story.
Yeah.
However, I had always wanted to be a writer, but all through those many years when I had the time, I was in school, I was in Europe, I could have written, I could never get started. And many people who are joining us right now are probably nodding their heads, because so many people have one project in their closet that they kind of can't get off the ground. And for me, that was writing a novel. So the turning point in my life was actually 9/11. I had come back from Poland and I went to law school. I graduated from the University of Pennsylvania. And my first day as a practicing attorney was actually September 4th, 2001.
Wow.
It was a Tuesday. And 1 week later, when 9/11 happened, I had this epiphany, this life moment where I said, wait a minute, being a lawyer is a fine and admirable profession, but I've also always wanted to be a novelist. And if I had been a 9/11 victim, I never would have realized that dream. Like, I don't have forever and I have to get started. So I took a course, a night course in Philadelphia, and that course was called Write Your Novel This Year. True. They later changed that to Write Your Novel This Month. And that sounds really scary. I'm not taking that one. But I took Write Your Novel This Year, and I started working on what would become my first book, The Commandant's Girl. Now, before I wrap up this very long and winding journey, there were 2 caveats to my serious writer plan. The first was, although I was a serious writer, I was also a new attorney with a day job at a big firm and $1,000 a month in student loan debt. And so I couldn't go sit in a castle and write these books. I had to make it coexist with my life. And in the beginning, for many years, I wrote the books from 5 to 7 every morning before I went to the firm. Now, years later, I have 3 middle schoolers. Middle school starts really early, and we have 6 pets. And so I don't get that 5 to 7 in the morning. I've had to find other ways, but that was the beginning. And the other catch when I became a writer, it was not a hop, skip, and a jump from my epiphany to your local library or independent bookstore. It was still 5 years and 39 publisher rejections until my first book was accepted. And so even though lots of people in publishing might now seem like they knew it all along, I still have the rejection letters right over there from all of them.
What keeps you going despite those rejections, especially since it took so many for your first book to come along? So many people always ask, how do you stay motivated?
Well, it's interesting. I will tell you the actual like aha moment of the publication story, which is when my then agent sent out Commandant's Girl, it was rejected by everybody right out of the box. And so the agent said to me, go write another book, as though it's that easy, and we'll sell them together. So I was toiling away on a second book for about 11 months.
Yeah.
And one Friday at the law firm, late in the afternoon, it was April 8th of 2005, and my phone rang, and I saw the agent's number pop up on the caller ID. I thought, oh, because even back then, people pretty much emailed. So I picked up the phone, and I said, are you calling to fire me? And because the poor guy hadn't made a dime off of me. He said, no. And then I said, well, are you calling to yell at me because I haven't finished another book? He said, no. One publisher, we didn't even know they were still reading it, and they made a tiny little offer for Commandant's Girl. And away we went. So, I mean, what kept me going? I don't know at that point. I believe, to do this, you either have to really want it, or you have to really want something or really not want something to make a commitment like this. And I think I just really wanted it. But I'll tell you, that writer's workshop I started in after 9/11, I still remember the people in it. I still remember their work. There were many writers in there who are still to this day better writers than me. And that's not false modesty. That's the truth. But I believe the only reason I got published is because I kept knocking. At one point, I think the agent said to me, like, you're my only writer who's still with this after all these years, and I was just really stubborn.
So why historical fiction? I mean, I know you gave us the background, but like, what is your mission in writing historical fiction? There has to be something more than you just had a background in looking at these documents in Poland.
Well, there's a few missions specific to the why, and then there's a little bit of theme woven in. So, if I look back, even before Poland, I was always reading historical fiction. And I remember those big books. And interestingly, back then, I think they were mostly written by men. But I'm thinking of Herman Wouk, Leon Uris, James Michener, John Jakes, who just passed away, like the big, thick historical books. And I love them, and I love historical fiction. But what I really came out of Poland with was like, I wanted to tell these stories of the people, and I consider my books love stories to the people who lived through that most difficult era. However, excuse me. However, when you look more broadly at why I'm doing this, I think it really comes down to two things. The first is I grew up with a very traditional view of history, kind of the black and white history, the battles and all of that. And then I went and lived in Europe, and I found those views very much changed. And what I came away with from those years living abroad is that history is not made up of these big, broad decisions. It's actually an infinite number of individual people making choices. And so really, when I write these books, I want readers to kind of stand in the shoes of my protagonist and ask, what would I have done in these circumstances? And then the other piece is, in my books, I write about men and women, but often women, who through normal history, they would have lived on this very certain path. But then war or catastrophe happens, and they're tested and they're challenged. They're thrown off the path, and they interact with people who they never would have met in other circumstances. I really love to see these people from different walks of life transcending their differences, because I believe if a reader can see characters doing that and empathize, it may help to reduce some of the otherness and division we're all feeling in our lives today.
Mm-hmm. Bring us back to that community and that connection.
Yes.
Well, I think that that's a good point to kind of turn to Code Name Sapphire. Denise is asking, For those of us who haven't finished the book yet, can you talk a bit about your novel, Code Name Sapphire, and give us a short summary?
Sure, and I won't spoil anything, but in order to really tell you about this book, I'd like to take the liberty of telling you how I found the idea and kind of how
Please.
I find ideas in general. Because although I lived among the survivors, I don't tell their stories. Those aren't necessarily mine to tell. And so when I'm looking for an idea for a book, I go looking for a piece of history to build a story around. And what I'm looking for in that research is I'm looking for what I call the gasp. Because if I can find a piece of history that after more than a quarter century of working with the war is so fresh and untold that it makes me gasp, then I'm hopeful that readers will feel the same way. And so in the case of Codename Sapphire, I never have a book here, but I have a book here. In the case of Codename Sapphire, the gasp was learning that there was a train headed from Belgium to Auschwitz with prisoners inside, Jewish prisoners. And there was a brave group of young people who endeavored to stop that train in its tracks, break it open, and free the people inside. And hearing that, I gasped. And after the gasp, what I'm really looking for is then what I call the questions. And in this case, I wanted to know, how had these young people been so brave to do this, to attempt this? And at the same time, why hadn't more people tried to do this sort of thing? And so that's where my idea came from. And in Codename Sapphire, we first meet Hannah. Hannah is a German Jewish political activist, and she's a young woman. She lost everything. She's lost her fiancé. She's lost her unborn child. And Hannah has to get out of Europe. She's a wanted woman. And so she boards a ship for North America, but her ship is turned away from the United States and from Cuba. And so Hannah finds herself back in Europe, and she lands in Brussels and finds shelter with her cousin Lily. Now, Lily is altogether different because Lily is affluent. She's married to a doctor. She has a young son, and Lily is trying to pretend like the war is not happening to her. But Hannah still needs to get out of Europe. And so Hannah connects with what is known as the Sapphire Line. Sapphire is a resistance network that is engaged in the very important work of helping downed Allied airmen escape occupied territory. Sapphire is run by a brave young woman named Micheline, and Micheline strikes up a deal with Hannah. She says, you help us with the Sapphire work, we'll get you out of Europe for good. But Hannah gets in too deep with Sapphire, and through a series of mishaps and mistaken identity, her work results in the arrest of Lily, Lily's husband, and Lily's young son. And so when Lily's family is put on the train that is slated for deportation, it is Hannah and her cohorts who endeavor to free them.
What does that research process look like then? So you start with that one gasp moment, and then do you then just insert fiction around that? And that's, I mean, Amy is asking, how do you go about your research for your books? Your storylines are so distinct, given that the setting and the themes are so similar. How do you keep them from becoming formulaic?
So, there's so many questions embedded in there. I'll try and take as many as I can without being long-winded. I want to talk about research, though. I was once on a panel, I'll never forget, with two authors who write modern stories. And one of them said, yeah, just kind of turn on the computer and start typing. I was like, you what? Because, for historical fiction, there's this whole other job with research, which I love. I have a master's in history. I love dusty archives. But I always say that when you talk about research, there's really three questions you have to ask. How do you do the research? How do you weave the history research into the fiction so that you don't get a big dump of material in there just because I thought something was really cool and then it stops the plot? Third, how do you not mess up the research? Because every project that big, you're always worried about that mistake and they can slip through. And so I always think when I'm worried about the mistakes of, does anyone remember Game of Thrones when they accidentally left the Poland Springs water bottle in the shot on set? That makes me feel so much better. But seriously, I won't answer all of these questions, but with respect to research, there's a lot available. So once I have an idea and I'm really going to start building up a world, there's so many things I can use. I can use periodicals from the era, photographs, memoir, correspondence, maps. And if you're really lucky, someone has written an amazing nonfiction book that has so much of what you need. So in particular for this project, there was a nonfiction book called The 20th Train that talked about the real life train break that was super helpful for facts.
Mhm. To follow up, Cynthia is asking, she's saying, I marvel at the small historical details which make your stories feel so authentic and true to their time. And Cynthia wants to know how you keep it all organized to be able to provide such detail and not forget where it applies and when. Do you do outlining? How do you organize your research and writing?
Well, so it kind of goes to the writing question. So you've had other authors on here, and I'm sure, have they talked about plotters and pantsers? So,
Uh-huh.
right. So I'm going to start from the beginning in case people haven't heard this, but they say there are two types of writers, plotters and pantsers. Now, plotters are the dear souls who write everything in a chronological order. They make it look nice before they move on. And you can tell by the way I'm saying that that's not me. I am a pantser, and pantser means by the seat of your pants. And so I have an idea, I turn on a computer and I go, blah, and like words come out in a really random order. This is the worst way ever to write a book because the editing is very, very rough, but it's the only way I know how to do it. So I pants on for like 3 or 4 months and 50,000 words. And at some point, this thing becomes so unwieldy that I have to stop, make chapters. I usually do a little table in Word that lines up like, okay, chapter 1, time and date. This is what happens. This is what you learn. And this is what I have to fix, like to keep it straight. But I'm mostly a pantser. And I also have a notebook, but the notebook is more for brainstorming and problem solving. It's not like I write my manuscripts longhand.
So we've had quite a few pantsers on here. And the interesting thing to me is that several of them have said that they know how their book is going to end when they start writing it, but that they just don't know what's in between. Is that you? Do you know how it's going to end when you start writing?
Well, so first I'm going to answer that, and I'm going to have a small confession. So the thing is, when people say, "Did you know at the beginning?" I'm never sure really what the beginning was, since it all comes out at the same time. Like, they say, "Did you know this?" I'm like, I'm not really sure. It all came out at once. But I'm going to give you a confession, which is that I'm a slightly reformed pantser, and here is why. I turned in a book a couple books ago. And I handed in this manuscript. It was like my 11th book. And my beloved editor read it and she goes, "No." I was like, "No?" And she's like, "No." And after 11 books, I had written a total stinker of a novel, which then had to be rewritten 95% of it in
Wow.
5 months. I never want to do that again. And so I do a rough outline at the beginning just to make sure I'm headed the right way. I'm still a pantser once I'm writing, but there's a little bit of that outlining. So I do have more of an idea of where I'm going than I used to. But for me, it opens with a cinematic image, like the opening. I kind of can see roughly where the end is. And then there's that dark middle. And I think in the middle, if you're lucky, there's 1 or 2 scenes you can see that are kind of like high moments. And they almost act like lighthouses as you're kind of trying to make your way across the middle. You can see those.
Mhm. Do you think it was COVID that affected this last book?
The stinker book?
Yeah.
No, I wish I could blame it on that, but I'm going to tell you why I know it wasn't COVID. It was just a stinker book. Thank you for that out. I wrote this book, right? And when you get feedback like that, and I'll never forget, I had to get the feedback from my editor. I was driving somewhere because I'm always driving. I was driving somewhere and I needed to sit down and take notes. So I pulled into like a Bob Evans along the side of the highway. It's the only time it's like a diner kind of thing.
Yeah.
I pull into a Bob Evans and sit down, get some coffee to take notes. And when you get bad news like that as a writer, here's what I do. First of all, you shake an angry fist at the heavens. You wring your hands for like 10 minutes. And then there's this quote from The Godfather Part 2. This is the business we have chosen. And I always tell myself that when I have to take on something tough. So I had to take on this huge, massive, total rewrite. I decided to make lemonade out of lemons because this book was set in Poland. And I said, I'm going back to Poland for research. I had not been to Poland in 17 years. There are people I want to see. So I booked a really nice trip to Poland. The good airfare, the good hotel, mom only, no kids.
Nice.
I booked that trip for March 11th, 2020. And so now everybody goes back to their mental planners and like, oh, Pam. And as COVID started to bubble up, my editor said, we don't think you should go to Poland, because Poland was bad right after Italy. It got like really bad before we did. I said, I'm going to Poland and I'm going to wear one of those masks, because we didn't know what that was. The flight shut down on March 11th. And thank God they did, because I had an emergency appendectomy on March 12th. I would have been in the air somewhere. So it all worked out great.
Oh,
but
wow.
I never got to go. But the reason I can tell you with honesty that it wasn't COVID that made me write a stinker book was because I had written it and been told to rewrite before the flight shut down. So I know I can't blame it on that. But thank you. That's a great question.
So Ingrid wants to talk about the parts of the story in Code Name Sapphire that really happened. So we know that the ship being turned away and the train, people trying to stop the train that was filled with individuals on their way to Auschwitz. Is there anything else that actually happened?
So here are the parts. So anytime someone says that one of my books is based on actual events, I cross it out. I say inspired by, because I always get very nervous. I think as historical fiction authors, we can get in trouble by staking too large a claim around what is true in our books. And so I always say my books are all fiction, but the true pieces of history that inspired me, number one, the train, the 20th train. Number two, the ship going across and getting turned away was inspired by the St. Louis, but I changed the name of my ship because I had to mess with the dates and I didn't want to expropriate the real history. Number three, the Sapphire Line, headed by Micheline, was inspired by a real line called the Comet Network, or the Comet Line, which was run also by a young woman. And so that was a true piece of inspiration. I was very inspired in learning by the way that the Germans had come into Belgium and kind of pretended to be these good occupiers, when in fact, of course, that was a total lie. But the kind of way that they came in, and also the camp that they were in Belgium, was inspired by one of two actual camps just outside Brussels. So those are predominantly the true pieces that inspired the book. Okay.
Laura wants to talk more about your characters. She says even the minor ones, they have such depth to them, and you have such strong female leads. How do you develop your characters to give them such life and depth, even the minor ones?
Well, I'm going to tell you that being a pantser, I don't do like character interviews or character sketches to get to know them. I get to know them through the writing and through the blah of the words. And somebody once said that being a plotter is like scaffolding. You build scaffolding. But being a pantser is like an archaeological dig. We're like picking up this thing and dusting it off and trying to see what it is. So I really do meet the characters through the writing, which is not to say I might not sit down with a notebook and develop thoughts on them as I'm writing, but I don't like plan them out. It kind of comes up through seeing what they do and how they respond, you know? So for this book, I knew I wanted these two women, Hannah and Lily, who were very different. They were cousins and they hadn't seen each other in a long time. And then later, Micheline kind of walked in and she was the third. And then, of course, there's always a decision. I've written from one point of view, 2 points of view, and three. And this is three, which is kind of like braiding, you know, the women. So, yes.
Well, and Mateo was a huge part of the book as well. So how do you weave that really important relationship into your character development? Is that something that's just like kind of picking at you as you sleep at night? Like, I need to put more in?
No, it's, you know what? I don't set out. First of all, I'm terrible at writing romance. It's not my forte. Everyone on my team knows this is not my strength, and that's okay. But because I have people who can help me if I'm not doing it well. But I don't set out to like make a love triangle or put someone in. What the reality is that these are young women and that even during the war, love happened. And so having this love interest and this complicated situation, I'm fascinated by questions of our past and the ways that our past circled back on us. So that played into it. Mateo also is Micheline's brother. And I really enjoyed writing about that sibling bond. I have a brother, and we're very close, and so I really enjoyed exploring the sibling aspect of it. So I write a lot of women, but there are men, and I want them to be real as well.
Mhm. Donna is expressing some upset nearing the end of Code Name Sapphire at Hannah's impulsiveness.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Without giving anything away, can you talk about kind of this this evolution of Hannah?
Well, look, without spoiling the book, it's, you when I write history, I'm writing the gray areas in people. So for a long time, ever since my first book, my characters are multifaceted, and even my heroes are very flawed. And people were so torn by what to save and who to save and what to stand for and what to do, that it's really hard to second guess any of their choices. And that's probably all I can say without ruining it.
Okay, yeah. Terry wants to know if there's any part of the story that was edited out that you wish would have stayed in.
On this book, I'm trying to think. I mean, there are books where I've had big storylines edited out, but in this one, there was a lot more I wanted to say about in real life. Okay. First of all, some of the stuff about the train break came from real life, like from how they stopped the train and put the light on the track, and how some of the resistance refused to help once the Germans had switched to cattle cars instead of passenger cars, because it was harder to break people out if there were no windows. But one real piece that I would have liked to do more with is the role of the people in the camp in getting ready for the break, whether that was making sure certain people were in the right car, or whether they were gathering weapons, or the self-empowerment of the people who knew in advance about the break and were able to demonstrate agency in helping themselves. I wish I had more space in the story for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Cheryl is saying your ending was a fascinating twist. Totally stunned.
Thank you. I will say no more.
Yeah. The rest of the question was, how would you describe this book's ending? But I mean, is there something that you wanted people to take away by ending the book in the way that you did?
I just think the war is so messy and so complicated. In my book, some people have happy endings and some people have sad endings, and some people we never know their endings. And that's really how it was. Not everybody got all the answers, and definitely a lot of people did not get the answers they wanted or should have gotten. And so I wanted to explore all of that complexity in a way that would still give people hope.
Mm-hmm. Hope. That's pretty solid. Hope. That's beautiful.
Thank you.
We had quite a few people ask about your research into the Belgian resistance, and I took note of a couple of them because there were so many questions that were pretty similar about it. But Janice is saying, how did you research the Belgian resistance, and were you able to interview people who'd served in it? And Jerome kind of piggybacks on that, saying that he's interested in hearing your research into the underground networks in Belgium, because I have relatives who were active in such networks in Poland, and also because of stories told by my late father, who was a field artillery commander in Italy, France, and Germany during the war.
So thank you for those questions. I mean, I'm very taken by the notion of resistance. And if you've read Code Name Sapphire is my 12th book. And if you've read the other ones, there's resistance. I've looked at the resistance in France and the resistance in Poland, and just sort of all different places. It's kind of a theme with me. But what's interesting to me, first of all, before I get into the answer, not all resistance was the same, right? Like, not all the work people were doing was the same. Whether this group is getting out airmen, this group is engaging in sabotage and subversion, this group is dealing with espionage. Like, it was very nuanced and multifaceted by country. Within the countries, there were multiple groups, and not all the groups had the same aims. So sometimes their aims, like, this group wants to work quietly, and this group wants to blow things up, and this group says our mission is to help these people, not those people. Hard choices. So resistance is a very complicated thing. So I looked a lot at the Comet Network, and there's many wonderful books. I wish I had them right here. I would hold them up that have been written. There's one, I don't want to get the titles wrong, but I've done some lists of them and those sorts of things. A lot of books about Comet, but Comet wasn't the only line. There was another line called Dutch Paris, and just many, many other lines. If you look at the maps of how they got people out in this particular type of work. So very complicated. Read about Comet, read about the leader, the female leader, Dee Dee. One of the things that's really interesting to me about a resistance line like Comet, it's not just like the young people doing the strong work. There are people of all ages, local people. They had to have safe houses. They had to have drop boxes. They needed documents, food, money, clothes, all of these things. Many local people were helping. And here's the difference. If you're like some young resistance fighter and it all goes south, you can head off into the woods. But if you're a local shopkeeper with a family of 6 and the network gets compromised, you're a sitting duck. And so the levels of heroism at all ages were just really remarkable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's beautiful. I'm going to hit you up for some of the names of those books because I'm interested too.
I'll get them to you. I'm just tired and I don't want to misstate them.
I understand. So we get the question, what is your favorite book that you've written? But Becca has worded it in a different way that I like, because most people will say, well, it's my current baby. But Becca has asked, who or what is your favorite heroine from your books and why?
That's just as hard. So favorite book, I don't have a favorite because they're all like my children. And there's the firstborn, which is Commandant's Girl. There's the new baby, Code Name Sapphire. And before I get to the question about characters, what I want to say about books is not which one is the favorite, but I want to say as an author, books really grow up alongside your life, right? So there's the book, The Winter Guest I wrote, which has twin sisters I had when I had baby twins. And I know which book I was writing when my dad passed. And I know which book is the COVID book. And so all of these books are really special and meaningful because of the way they happen alongside your life. And I'm going to tell you, there's no correlation between the books I love and the books that have done well. Like some of my sentimental favorites are kind of the underdogs you might have never heard of. So it's an interesting relationship with the whole group of books. Characters, I don't know if I have a favorite. In general, people say, who do you relate to? I relate to the most disheveled character in my book. So if there's a glamorous, elegant, well-refined woman, it's not me. And that's just personal. It's true. But I will say in this book, I related to different people for different reasons. I related to Hannah's sense of loss. I related to Lily's sense of motherhood. I related to Micheline's close relationship with her sibling. Everyone had a little something that I related to.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We have both Kathy and Charlotte submitted questions kind of at the same time about your future books and whether or not you were going to stick with a World War II as the backdrop, or if there were other time periods that you were interested in for future novels.
So I should say at the outset that not all of my books have been World War II. Of the 12, 2 are modern. One is like a modern historical hybrid. I've written other historical time periods, like The Ambassador's Daughter was right after World War I in kind of that Downton Abbey space. And I've also written a World War II book on the home front called The Last Summer at Chelsea Beach. And so there's kind of a range. I love the war, and I find there's still so many stories to tell there. As long as I can find those stories and tell them with a great deal of respect, almost reverence, I can't say that I'm going to entirely stay at the war because there's other periods that interest me, but I will say that I think there's always going to be an element of the war in the books, at least for now, while these stories are here.
Mm-hmm. I just got a really interesting question from Teresa. She says, I am a high school English and creative writing teacher. This grading period, we read nonfiction accounts from World War II, such as Anne Frank and The Boys Who Challenged Hitler. We reflected on the question, how do small stories shape our understanding of big events? Teresa is curious to know how you would answer that question. How do small stories shape our understanding of big events, especially as an author who writes about these big events?
Well, it just so personalizes it. And it goes back to that every decision is an individual decision, right? And so if you think about World War II books, they are very popular. And I would submit that one of the reasons World War II remains popular is you have very dire circumstances and you have stark choices. And these books, they really put readers in the shoes of the protagonist and have the reader say, what would I have done? And I think it's that question point that really helps to make the experience of history relatable to readers.
Hmm. I have to ask, do you journal? Because we've been getting a lot of questions about journaling um, today. And Edith specifically said, how do you keep yourself consistent and motivated to continue journaling? So I feel like I missed an interview by you somewhere.
No, I don't. I should journal. I wish I journaled. I don't get the time and space to journal in a day, which is sort of, it maybe is a little sad. I wish I did, but if I had that time, it would probably go to the writing. I mean, I focus, I reflect in a lot of ways. And I do. There's certain things I do. I mean, I think work is almost a kind of self-care. It's a really awful thing to say, but the consistency of writing 7 days a week, the time at my computer, I run, and that provides time for contemplation, to be out in nature. So I wish I was journaling, but I'm probably reflecting in other ways.
Kind of going off of work as self-care, Quana and me, we both want to know, how do you have time to teach and write and be a mom to children and pet mom? You have such great books and so many. How do you
Well, I
keep?
like to say, I mean, I joke that I do too many things, and none of them well. But really, I only do three things. I mom. I'm trying to say these in the right order. I mom, I write, and I teach, right? I do those three things, and that's it. I stay in my lane. I do not make anything look nice, like not my house, not my children, not myself. I have not cooked dinner since the first Obama administration, and that is not a line. That is the truth. I just do my three things, and if I hit Powerball, if I had time to play Powerball, I would still do all three things. I would just slow down a little bit because I love each and every one of them. So I have no great secrets. I could use a little more sleep. I'm very lucky to have a husband who could always juggle babies. When I was on the road, I have a mom who lives a mile away, and I live in squalor because who has time? But I think it's Anne Lamott who said, before children, I couldn't write if there were dirty dishes in the sink. After children, I could write if there was a corpse in the sink. And so you just kind of have to focus.
Yeah, I like that.
Right? You get it, Brandon. You're like, yes.
Yeah. Shelley is saying, would you like to see a cover of one of your books not feature a woman in historical dress looking into the distance?
Ooh, good question. So I am very attuned to all the discussions about why do all these covers have such and such, and why do all these titles have such and such. And I will say, first of all, I actually have reasonably little to do with covers or titles. And I don't say that to disown it. I love my covers, I love my titles, but there are people who are really talented with a good visual aesthetic who work on these things and they show them to me. But it's not, again, it's not my lane. It's not what I do. And I have had covers without that on there, like The Orphan's Tale, or, there have been plenty of covers that don't have that on there, but I understand that they predominate. And I think it's not just the publishers. This is my outside opinion. I know nothing about publishing, but the publishers and these really talented design teams come up with things that they think will work and will appeal and will attract readers, and then they do share it, I believe, with the various stakeholders, whether that's stores or whoever's going to be taking the books. And I feel like there's a really, even though people have views on the covers and all of that, I think there's a really thoughtful dialogue that goes on around what covers should look like. And I'm not one of the major players in that dialogue, but if there was ever a cover that I didn't think did my book or the time period justice, I would speak up. And I have. And so it's really a collaborative conversation. I love my covers. I really do.
Yeah, I like the covers too.
Yes.
Um, Andy is asking a question. I also had a pre-submitted question from Andrea. So if they're the same person, then yay. Um, about braided narratives. So in some of your books, you write using multiple narrative threads. And in The Woman with the Blue Star, both your threads are first person. And so Andy is wondering, did you do this intentionally to twist the ending? Do you find these multi perspectives more challenging or more satisfying?
Both. So I will tell you, when I turned in that stinker book, which was The Woman with the Blue Star, one of the two major changes they asked me to make was I had only had one point of view of the Jewish woman who was in the sewer. And they said, can you get the point of view from the woman on the street who she develops the relationship with? And so that's how that actually became a two-person book, two point of view book. But for me, it's always a question of, what is the story that needs to be told here? Whose point of view? And once you decide 1, 2, or 3 points of view, you also do have to decide, am I going with the first person or the third person in terms of how you speak? That's an artistic question. Then when you set it up, a book like Code Name Sapphire, and you start braiding the 3 points of view, here's the biggest thing I want to say about that. I learned that it's not always A, B, C, A, B, C. Sometimes it becomes A, B, C, C, B, C, B, A, because sometimes one character needs more space to tell their story. And so what you're going for is not perfect symmetry, but an overall balance by the end of the book.
Okay, thank you for that.
Yeah.
We have Linda asking about The Orphan's Tale. Do you mind answering a question?
Of course, any book. I'll still shush them if they ruin the ending, but other than that, any book is fair game.
Well, this is, I think, a softball question, probably, but we all want to know what inspired the book The Orphan's Tale, Linda is asking.
So, The Orphan's Tale came out in 2017. It's actually a really special book to me. It was my breakout book. So, I was not an overnight success. It took 10 years for any book I had written to hit the list, and that was The Orphan's Tale. The Orphan's Tale was inspired by 2 true stories that I found in the Yad Vashem virtual archive. So the first was a horrific story about what was called the boxcar of unknown children. So it was a train which was headed to a concentration camp. And on that train were children, babies, who had been taken from their parents too young to know their own names. It was an awful story. And then the other story out of Yad Vashem was an incredible tale of a German circus, which had sheltered Jews and hidden Jews during the war, which I had never heard. And so I've combined these two in The Orphan's Tale. And there is a young Dutch girl named Noah who finds the train of babies and rescues a baby from that train, and she flees and she finds shelter with the German circus and has to become part of their act, part of their troupe in order to hide. And so it's about the friendship between this young Dutch girl, Noah, and an aerialist with the circus named Astrid. And it's about whether they can sort of transcend their differences and come together to save themselves.
Yeah, I see what you mean by gasp moments. Like, what?
The circus. And then once I found that circus, about the German circus, I started researching, and I found this incredible book that talked about Jewish circus dynasties in Europe before the war. Who knew? It was an amazing story.
Yeah, that is amazing. That's really amazing.
Thank you.
Another book that I read as an offshoot by Constance Sayers, the women of the ladies of the secret circus, is a beautiful history of all of these circuses throughout Europe.
I'll have to look for that one.
Yeah, it is. It's fiction, but you get a lot of the history of. So it reminds me of that. So we've had a couple of people asking about if any of your books are going to be turned into movies or limited series, and Margaret is asking which are and is any of that in the talks, and which do you want or which do you think would be a good series or movie?
So if you had asked me this 4 or 5 years ago, I would have said from your mouth to God's ears, because, I really wanted that to happen. And finally, we do have an option on just one book. It's The Lost Girls of Paris. And it was originally a movie option, and now it's an option for a limited run TV series. And I don't know much about it. Like, you don't hear much, except that last year I had the chance to Zoom with the screenwriter. And I was supposed to be giving her information about the book. She was so brilliant about storytelling that I was scribbling notes furiously. So will this ever be made into a product? I don't know, but it's fun to have the possibility.
Yeah, that's exciting.
Thank you.
So Mallory, age 9, is I'm sorry, Mallory, we kind of answered that question already. I jumped the
Hi,
gun.
Mallory.
She was asking what's the favorite book that you've written, but we did talk about that. But can you talk about
But I'm still glad Mallory's here. Hello.
and can you talk about then, I guess we'll jump ahead. The question I usually ask last is what is your favorite book or author in general? But I'm going to kind of change Mallory's question just a little bit and make it Mallory's question. What is your
All
favorite?
right. Oh, goodness. I don't know. Favorite book is tough, right? Like a favorite book is really, really tough. And a favorite author is tough, now too.
Depends on your mood. Like, what do you feel like
Right.
reading? And
Yeah. I mean, the book that influenced my writing the most, and I know this is not what you're asking about, is a book called Writing Down the Bones by Natalie Goldberg. And she takes a Zen Buddhist approach to writing, where your hand does not stop to edit. You just get the words out. And that's probably why I'm such a pantser, is because of Natalie Goldberg. So, but in terms of what I read, like, honestly, I read everything. Can we talk about how we read for a second? Still the libraries all the time. I'm not saying not to buy books, but after you support your independent bookstore, go to your library, because between me and the kids, it's a volume issue. Like, I could not keep up without libraries. I read a lot in the pickup line, waiting for children at school. You should always have a book in your car. This is super important.
I listen to them while I'm in that line.
Oh, are you an audio person?
Yeah, while I'm driving, because I'm driving so much, I get at least an hour and a half a day on an audiobook.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I have not listened to as much audio, although I will tell you that I do get to listen when they're picking audio narrators and give an opinion. And someone asked a few minutes ago about the woman with the blue star and the 2 points of view, and whether I was trying to sort of hide who was doing what. When we had the audio, we had a problem with that because we had 2 different narrators. And there's this one chapter toward the end of the book where you're not supposed to know who's talking. And I said, well, which narrator are we going to use? Because if we use one narrator, it's going to be a lie. And if we use the other narrator, then it's going to spoil the ending. So that was my foray with audiobooks into trying to figure that out.
Yeah.
Yes. I didn't answer who my favorite author or book is. I read everything. I have at least 3 Pinterest boards where I've done 100 days of books, where every day I listed a book that I loved. I read all the thrillers, all the lighthearted books, all the historical, pretty much across the board.
Mm-hmm. You do an amazing job on your social media of calling out the happy pub days for your fellow authors. We actually had where is that question? We had Judy says, can you please talk about your sisterhood with other female authors? I see you quoted on so many books of fellow authors.
Yes, I would love to. So let me say before that books generally come out on Tuesdays, and we're doing this on a Tuesday, and there's so many good books that came out today. So they're all up on my social media, but happy book birthday to all the authors who had books come out today. So the Sisterhood of Authors for me really began when I was in the Grand Central anthology that you mentioned. I was in an anthology of stories called Grand Central, and I can tell you when it was. I was about 8 years ago. And when I was asked to do this, I said, I'm not a short story writer. Like, I'm a one-hit wonder. I just write novels. That's it. And then I heard who these other authors were who were part of the anthology. And I said, I'm a short story writer, because it was so many authors that I had admired. Christina McMorris and Allison Richmond and Karen White and all these authors who also wrote historical fiction. And all of our stories in that book crossed through Grand Central on the same day in 1945, kind of like this Love Actually woven together concept. And it was so much fun. And 7 of us got together for the launch in New York wearing they all wanted to dress in these period costumes. I was like, what? But anyhow, that was my first foray into real author friendship. And since then, I've built so many really, really close author friends. And it's mostly women, not entirely. There's some male authors who are total mensches, but there's this community of authors, which we had built before COVID. And then that was what was so amazing, because we had the infrastructure and we all supported each other. It was how we were able to pivot with all the bloggers and the influencers and the librarians and the booksellers and the readers to stay in touch and create amazing things like this consortium. So, I have all these amazing author friends, and I will say, I love promoting other authors' books. It's a spectacular joy. We see each other on the road or virtually. There are so many authors who have helped me out. So let's not talk about who I help. Let's talk about the many wonderful female authors who have made it, who, through the generosity of their hearts, have helped me out. And I'm talking about Lisa Scottolini, whose new book, Loyalties, out today. I'm talking about Kristen Hanna and Christina Baker-Klein and Mary Kay Andrews and Jodi Picoult, and I'm Lisa Wingate and Judy Bloom. And I'm going to leave so many people out just by naming names, but all of these very, very established authors who are continually reaching a hand down to help the next person coming up. And so really, it's just a joy to pay it forward and sort of, lower the ladder for someone else.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of joy, Anne is asking, what do you think is the most rewarding thing about your writing career? And maybe that was a glimpse at it. And what's the hardest thing about it?
This always was my rock star dream since I was a kid. So there's that moment of just realizing that I get to do this. There are these moments, I get so few quiet moments, that the moments when I actually am sitting at my computer and it's just me and the words, and I realize that I get to do this as part of my living, is one of the most amazing moments. I mean, seeing the books is great. Meeting readers is an amazing moment. But there's a quiet moment where you're like, I get to do this. And it's just such a surreal joy, more so than anything. There are lots of things that are hard. Revision is super hard. It gets really long and tedious and awful sometimes. I think publishing, honestly, is a tougher business, and there's stressors, and like anything else, everyone thinks about it, so I think you have to be really careful not to get caught up in that space. Reviews can be both wonderful and tough. Everything is two sides, being on the road and meeting people is wonderful. Being away and traveling is hard. So it's really about how you look at it and finding the joy and stopping to realize that, like, I get to be in this moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can relate to that, because I really get to do this for my job. Like, I get to talk to amazing authors for a living.
I don't want to be you a little bit. Is that okay, Brandon? Can we switch? Like, we do like a Freaky Friday switch for a day?
I don't know that it's going to be a bestseller, but I'll work on it.
Excellent. I trust you.
So, let's go ahead, and since I kind of asked my last question a while ago for Mallory, can you talk about Teresa wants to know, what is the best piece of writing advice that you have received and that you still use in your own writing? And then what would you like to impart upon the listeners today?
Oh, wonderful. Thank you for both of those. So it's a little bit of a cheat, but my advice to writers always is 3 parts. You have to be disciplined with your time, because even now, after all these years, no one, not my sainted husband or my mom, would say, why don't you go take time to write? Like, you have to find it. As women and as all the demands on our lives, you must be disciplined with that writing time. You must be tenacious, because, as I said, many years, I just kept knocking at that door till it opened up. And finally, you have to develop the ability to revise. You have to take someone else's feedback and put it into your own words. And so those are kind of my big 3. And in terms of really what I'd like to leave people with, aside from thank you from the bottom of my heart, is I just want to say, find me, because I don't love the one and done conversation. I would like to establish a dialogue over time. So especially now that my book tour is largely wrapping up, and I'm not saying Code Name Sapphire every 5 minutes, mostly what I post about online is either going to be other people's books or my yellow Labrador scoop. And so I invite you to find me, whether it's email, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, wherever you are hanging out, so that we can continue the conversation.
Thank you very much. We definitely want to continue the conversation. The hour went flying by.
Yeah. Thank you, Brandon.
Well, because we are at the top of the hour, I'm going to go ahead and tell Pam, thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Like I said, it's truly been a pleasure for the last hour. It's flown by. I also want to extend a huge thank you to all of our viewers for your amazing questions that you pre-submitted live and asked live. They were amazing. So thank you for that. Without your support, none of this would be possible. And so thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. As a reminder, below the live stream video, you can find a link to Pam's newest book, Code Name Sapphire. We look forward to seeing you all on April 4th when we talk to New York Times bestselling author and cartoonist Kate Beaton about her graphic memoir, Ducks, 2 Years in the Oil Sands. And again on April 27th when we chat with New York Times bestselling crime thriller author William Kent Kruger about his most recent book, Fox Creek. You can register for this and lots of other great events on your library's event page. I am Brandon Adler. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a good evening.